Henry Walker, a widower nearing 80, sat silently in the small room he now called home. Through the single window, he watched the world pass by on the busy streets of Portland, Maine. Cars honked as they weaved through traffic, pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, and the faint chatter of life filtered up to his second-floor window. It was a stark contrast to the stillness of his own existence, confined to the same four walls every day. His room, though clean and comfortable, felt more like a storage space for a man whose life had been reduced to a few suitcases and a handful of memories. The bookshelf held books he no longer had the energy to read. A desk in the corner, once a symbol of his productivity, was now cluttered with unopened mail and reminders of appointments he dreaded. On the nightstand sat a framed photo of Eleanor, his late wife, smiling warmly at the camera. It was the one thing in the room that felt alive, though it only deepened his loneliness. Henry had always been a man of pride and independence. For decades, he worked tirelessly to provide for his family, building a modest but fulfilling life in rural Vermont. But now his body betrayed him. His hands, once strong and steady, trembled with age. His knees, which had carried him through years of labor, now ached with every step. And his memory, once sharp enough to recall every detail of his past, had grown hazy, like a mist settling over the landscape of his mind. Living with his son Michael and daughter-in-law Sarah had been meant to be a temporary arrangement, a place to recover after the devastating fire that had taken everything from him. But temporary had stretched into months, and Henry could feel the weight of his presence pressing on the family. Every morning he watched Michael and Sarah leave for work, their goodbyes hurried and perfunctory. The guest room he occupied was once his grandson's, now stripped of its personality to accommodate him. Even though his grandson was away at college, Henry couldn't help but feel like he was taking something that didn't belong to him. Meals arrived courtesy of Mrs. Campbell, their kindly but overly candid neighbor, who seemed to be the only one with time to spare for an old man. Henry's guilt was a constant companion, gnawing at him in the quiet hours of the day. He had always been self-sufficient, the type of man who prided himself on solving problems rather than creating them. But now he felt like a burden, a word he hated but couldn't shake. The thought of moving to a nursing home had begun to creep into his mind, not as an exile but as a solution, a way to give Michael and Sarah their lives back. Yet the idea filled him with an unease he couldn't quite name. Was it fear of the unknown, or was it the finality of such a decision? Henry tried to rationalize his feelings. The nursing home wouldn't be so bad, he told himself. It would be quieter, simpler, no more feeling like an intruder in his own family's home. But even as he tried to convince himself, a hollow ache settled in his chest. What gnawed at him most wasn't just the feeling of being unwanted. It was the creeping sensation that his life no longer held purpose. He didn't just feel forgotten, he felt unnecessary, a relic of a time that no longer mattered. One evening, as he sat in his armchair, with the television murmuring in the background, Mrs. Campbell arrived with his dinner. She placed the tray on the table with her usual brisk efficiency. "You know, Henry," she said, her tone conspiratorial, "it's the same everywhere. Once we're old, our kids don't know what to do with us. It's not their fault, I suppose. They've got their own lives to live." Her words, though not unkind, landed heavily. Henry nodded silently, unable to muster a response. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Henry made up his mind. He couldn't stay here any longer. He couldn't continue to be a shadow of his former self, a man waiting quietly for his life to fade away. The decision brought a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that he could finally stop feeling like a burden. Sorrow at the thought of leaving behind the faint threads of connection that still tied him to his family. His eyes wandered to Eleanor's photo on the nightstand. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the darkness. "I've failed you. I never wanted to end up like this." For the first time in months, tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. He clutched the photograph to his chest, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. The next morning, he cornered Michael in the kitchen, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Take me to a nursing home," he said. "I've made up my mind. I can't keep living like this." Michael looked at him, surprised and visibly uncomfortable. "Dad, let's not talk about this right now. I've got a meeting to get to." Henry's frustration boiled over. "If you won't do it, I'll figure it out myself." But Michael simply patted him on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Henry standing alone in the kitchen, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let his pleas fall on deaf ears any longer. In the stillness of the house that day, Henry began to plan, though he had no idea that everything was about to change. Memories of another time. As Henry Walker sat alone in his quiet room, his mind often drifted to the life he once had. The present felt cold and unfamiliar, but his memories were vivid, warm, and bittersweet. They were the refugee he sought when the silence around him grew too heavy to bear. His thoughts always returned to the small wooden home he and Eleanor had built together in rural Vermont. It wasn't much by most standards, but to them, it was everything. Tucked away at the edge of a sprawling forest, the house stood proudly against the elements, weathered yet strong, a reflection of their life together. Eleanor had been the heart of that home. Her laughter had a way of filling every corner, her voice so warm it could chase away even the coldest Vermont winters. Henry could still picture her, standing at the kitchen sink with her hands deep in soapy water, singing along to old tunes on the radio. The scent of her apple pies baking in the oven seemed to linger in his senses, though it had been years since he'd tasted one. Eleanor had a way of making everything feel like it mattered. She wasn't just his wife, she was his partner, his reason to wake up every morning and work hard. The memories of those days weren't just filled with love, they were filled with purpose. Henry worked tirelessly to maintain their small property, planting a garden that produced enough vegetables to keep them through the harshest winters. And then there was Daisy, their loyal mare, who had helped plow the soil and pull the heavy carts loaded with fresh produce. But even the happiest memories were tinged with shadows. The day Eleanor fell ill was when everything began to change. What started as fatigue turned into something much worse. Henry had done everything he could. Doctor visits, medications, even prayers he hadn't uttered since childhood. But in the end, he was powerless. Losing her was like losing a piece of his soul, a wound that time had failed to heal. As he stared at the walls of his room in Portland, his mind lingered on the night the fire claimed the home they had built together. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. The power had gone out during a storm, and Henry had lit a candle to fight back the darkness. He had been so tired that night, the kind of exhaustion that clings to your bones after a long day in the garden. The sofa had beckoned, and before he knew it, he was asleep. When he woke, the air was thick with smoke, and the heat was unbearable. He stumbled through the house, coughing and disoriented. Flames had consumed everything. Eleanor's hand-sewn curtains, the photographs on the mantel, the little trinkets she'd collected over the years. Neighbors had burst through the door, dragging him outside just before the roof collapsed. He remembered standing in the yard, staring at the inferno as it devoured the life he and Eleanor had built together. Days later, when he woke in the hospital, the doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. But Henry didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow. The fire hadn't just taken his house, it had taken the last tangible connection to Eleanor, to the life they had shared. After the fire, Michael had insisted he come to Portland to recover. Henry had agreed, thinking it would be temporary, a brief respite to get back on his feet. But moving into Michael's home hadn't been the sanctuary he hoped it would be. Instead, it was a constant reminder of what he had lost. As Henry sat in the quiet of his room, his memories began to shift. He didn't just remember the happy times or the tragedy of the fire. He remembered the feeling of purpose that had once driven him. Back then, every day had meaning. Whether it was tending the garden, repairing the fence, or brushing Daisy's mane, there had always been something to do, something to strive for. But now what was left? The room around him was neat but lifeless, a far cry from the vibrant home he and Eleanor had filled with love. He felt like a ghost haunting someone else's space, his days blending together in a monotonous haze. Henry's mind replayed one particular moment from the night of the fire. A brief, fleeting image of Eleanor's photo, its frame melting in the heat, her face disappearing in the flames. He had failed her, failed to protect the life they had built. A knot formed in his stomach. The memories that once gave him comfort now felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on him. His hands trembled as he reached for the photograph, of Eleanor on his nightstand. He traced her smile with his thumb, his chest tightening. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I couldn't save it. I couldn't save us." The room felt colder than before, the walls closing in around him. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him one more time, a tide he could neither escape nor embrace. The sound of a distant car horn brought him back to the present. He opened his eyes and looked around the room. It was nothing like the home he had shared with Eleanor, but it was all he had now. Still, the memories wouldn't let him rest. They weren't just a reminder of what he had lost. They were a reminder of what he had been. And with that reminder came a thought that chilled him to the bone. What if that version of Henry Walker, the husband, the gardener, the man with a purpose, was gone forever? He swallowed hard, the ache in his chest growing. He wasn't sure how much longer he could carry this weight. Something had to change, but deep down, he feared it already had, and he wasn't sure there was any way to go back. Henry Walker's days in Michael and Sarah's home blurred together, a quiet monotony that stretched endlessly. He tried to keep himself busy, reading old books, tidying the already immaculate room, or staring out the window at the bustling Portland streets below. But no matter what he did, the weight of loneliness pressed down on him, relentless and suffocating. The house was always silent during the day, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the muffled hum of the refrigerator. Michael and Sarah left early each morning, their goodbyes hurried and detached. They had careers to focus on, lives to live. Henry couldn't blame them for that. Still, their absence felt like a cold void, a reminder of how disconnected he had become from the world around him. Each evening, Mrs. Campbell, the neighbor, brought him his meals. She was kind in her way, but her bluntness often left him unsettled. One evening, as she set down a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, she studied him with a critical eye. "You know, Henry," she said, sitting down uninvited at the edge of his bed, "it's the same story everywhere. We get old and our kids don't know what to do with us. They've got their own problems. Can't fault them for it, really." Henry forced a thin smile, but her words struck a nerve. She patted his hand as if to soften the blow. "I'm just saying, don't take it personally. It's the way of the world." After she left, Henry sat alone in the dimly lit room, the plate of food untouched. He knew she didn't mean to be cruel, but her words echoed in his mind long after she was gone. The guilt Henry already carried began to fester. He had once been a man of strength and purpose, a provider, a protector. Now he was a shadow of that man, dependent on others for even the simplest tasks. Every time he passed by the family photos lining the hallway, he felt a pang of shame. He didn't belong here, he thought. This wasn't his home. His birthday came and went with little fanfare. That morning, Michael had stopped by his room briefly to wish him well. "Happy birthday, Dad," he'd said, leaning in for an awkward pat on the shoulder before rushing out the door. Sarah had echoed the sentiment as she grabbed her car keys. By the time the door clicked shut behind them, the house was silent again. Mrs. Campbell arrived later with a single slice of cake wrapped in foil. She lit a small candle on top and sang "Happy Birthday" in a slightly off-key but earnest voice. "Make a wish," she said with a smile, placing the slice on the table in front of him. Henry stared at the flickering flame for a long moment before blowing it out. What could he possibly wish for? The thought filled him with a hollow sadness. After Mrs. Campbell left, he ate the cake alone, the sweetness tasting bitter against the loneliness that sat heavy in his chest. That night, Henry sat on the edge of his bed, holding Eleanor's photograph. "I don't belong here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm nothing but a burden." His thoughts began to spiral. The idea of moving to a nursing home no longer felt like a defeat. It felt like an escape, for Michael and Sarah as much as for himself. Perhaps they would feel relief without him around, no longer weighed down by the obligation of caring for an aging father. The next evening, he waited for Michael to come home, determined to speak his mind. As Michael walked through the door, exhausted from a long day, Henry cornered him in the kitchen. "Michael," Henry began, his tone steady but firm, "I need to talk to you." Michael glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "Can it wait, Dad?" "It's been a rough day." "No, it can't." Henry's voice rose slightly, surprising even himself. "I need you to take me to a nursing home." Michael froze, his hand halfway to the refrigerator door. "What?" You heard me, Henry said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Sell the land in Vermont. Use the money to pay for it. I don't want to be a burden to you or Sarah any longer. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Dad, come on, don't start this now. We'll talk about it later, okay? No, not later, Henry insisted, his voice shaking with emotion. If you won't do it, I'll find one myself. Michael didn't respond. Instead, he patted Henry's shoulder in a way that felt dismissive and walked out of the kitchen. As Henry stood there alone, a wave of anger and sadness washed over him. He felt invisible, as though his words had fallen into an abyss. That night he sat in the darkened room, clutching Eleanor's photograph and whispering apologies to her for becoming a man he no longer recognized. The days that followed were no better. Each night, Henry stared at the ceiling, the silence of the house amplifying his loneliness. He felt like a ghost haunting the lives of those he loved, present but unseen. The weight of it all became unbearable, and the resolve in his heart hardened. Something had to change. He couldn't keep living this way. But as he stared out the window at the city lights, a small, nagging voice whispered in the back of his mind, "What if it's too late?" An unexpected journey. Henry awoke on a Saturday morning to the sound of soft knocks on his bedroom door. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting with every movement. Before he could answer, the door creaked open, and Michael stepped in, holding a crisp white shirt and a neatly folded pair of slacks. Sarah followed behind him, carrying fresh towels and toiletries. "Morning, Dad," Michael said, his voice unusually calm yet unreadable. "I need you to pack your things." Henry froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Pack?" he echoed, his throat tightening. Michael nodded. "We're going on a trip." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his glasses on the nightstand. He wanted to ask where they were going, but the answer seemed too obvious. This was it. He'd been asking for this, hadn't he? And now, finally, Michael was taking him to a nursing home. Sarah smiled softly, placing the towels on the dresser. "We'll help you pack," she said, her tone light but strangely detached. "No need," Henry said, his voice rasping as he held back the wave of emotion swelling in his chest. "I can manage." They left him alone to prepare. Slowly, methodically, Henry began to fold his belongings, his movements deliberate, as though delaying the inevitable might somehow change it. He placed the essentials in his battered suitcase, shirts, slacks, socks, and the photograph of Eleanor, tucking it safely on top as though it could protect him from what was to come. As he zipped the suitcase, the act felt final, like the closing of a chapter he wasn't ready to end. His heart ached, his thoughts racing. "This is what you wanted," he reminded himself. "This is for the best." The car ride began in silence. Henry sat in the back seat, clutching the suitcase as if it were a lifeline. Michael's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Sarah stared out the window, a faint, almost amused smile on her lips. To Henry, her expression felt misplaced, out of sync with the somber weight he carried. The hum of the engine filled the air, punctuated only by the occasional rattle as the car hit uneven pavement. Portland's cityscape soon faded, replaced by open fields and winding country roads. The further they drove, the more isolated the surroundings became. Henry's mind raced with questions he didn't dare voice. His gaze flickered between the passing scenery and the rearview mirror, where he caught Michael glancing at him from time to time. His son's expression was inscrutable, calm yet distant. "Where are we going?" Henry finally asked, his voice cracking under the strain of his nerves. "You'll see," Michael replied cryptically, his lips curling into a faint smile that only deepened Henry's unease. The rolling hills and dense woods reminded Henry of Vermont. The smell of pine drifting through the open window tugged at his memories. He closed his eyes and was momentarily transported to days spent with Eleanor, driving down similar roads, their laughter filling the air as they talked about their dreams for the future. But this wasn't a nostalgic journey. This road felt endless, a path leading him away from everything he knew and understood. The isolation of the landscape mirrored the loneliness that had plagued him for months, and his anxiety mounted with every mile. The car slowed suddenly, the gravel crunching under the tires. Michael parked in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as the engine went silent. "We're here," Michael said, stepping out and opening the back door for him. Henry hesitated, gripping the suitcase tighter. His knees felt weak as Michael helped him out of the car. Sarah retrieved the suitcase from the trunk, her expression unreadable. Henry adjusted his glasses, squinting against the bright sunlight. His heart raced as he braced himself for the sight of a sterile gray nursing home tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Instead, what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Before him stood a house he recognized all too well. His house, but it wasn't the charred, blackened skeleton he had last seen. It was whole, restored to its former glory, every detail lovingly rebuilt. The white paint gleamed in the sunlight, the porch railings freshly painted, the windows sparkling like new. The garden, once overrun with weeds after the fire, had been replanted, vibrant flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Henry's knees buckled and Michael quickly caught him. "Careful, Dad," he said softly. "What? What is this?" Henry stammered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Michael smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Welcome home, Dad." Henry's legs gave out, and he clung to Michael for support as the weight of what he was seeing sank in. This wasn't just a house, it was a lifeline, a resurrection of everything he thought he had lost forever. The car slowed, turning onto a gravel road that led to a clearing. Henry's breath caught as he stepped out. Before him stood his Vermont home, fully rebuilt. "What is this?" Henry stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael smiled. "Welcome home, Dad." Inside, Henry found everything lovingly restored, the polished wooden floors, the familiar furniture, even Eleanor's favorite vase on the windowsill. Michael explained, "We used the land to rebuild, with help from the community. Every detail is for you." In the yard, Daisy stood tied to a post, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. Tears streamed down Henry's face as he embraced the horse he thought he'd lost forever. A heart restored. For the first time in years, Henry felt whole. Sitting on the porch with Michael and Sarah that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Henry realized he wasn't a burden. "You've given me more than a house," he said. "You've given me my life back." Michael reached for his father's hand. "You've always been the foundation of this family. This is where you belong." And for the first time, Henry allowed himself to believe it.